Okay, so I think we can start now, and if anyone's joining us later, they can just join as we go along. So welcome everyone to this workshop on ecology making a difference, engaging policy on climate change. And this workshop is organised by the British Ecological Society Climate Change Group. I'm Orly Rasgore, and I'm the chair of the British Ecological Society Climate Change Group. And I'm also an associate professor at the University of Exeter. Just to let everyone know that this session is being recorded and will be shared on the British Ecological Society YouTube channel. Okay, so let's start with some housekeeping. I know we're all very used to these online kind of meetings, but just so we're all on the same page, we ask people that during the presentation, if you can keep your microphone muted and use the chat to ask questions or write any comments you may have. We're going to have some opportunities to ask questions as well. So please use the chat to ask questions and indicate your question with a Q, 2 dots at the start, something like this. So it'll be obvious for us that it's a question. We can find it among the other comments. Now, questions will be read by the chair, just because we have quite a lot of participants and to keep the conversation going. We also have a breakup room session, and in the breakup room session, we ask people if they can keep the microphone and video on, so we have some engagement. And we also ask people to be respectful and inclusive and think about other people. And we'll have some feedback sessions as well, where the breakup room facilitators will be reporting back. Okay, so in terms of the agenda, we're starting now with the introduction and housekeeping. Then we're going to have presentations from 4 invited speakers with a lot of experience with engaging and working with policy. This will be followed by a panel discussion where towards the end of it, there'll be an opportunity to get some questions from the audience as well. Then we're going to hear from the British Ecological Society policy team about the different tools that they have. And this will be followed by a breakout session. So for 15 minutes, you'll get to discuss these issues with somebody with experience of working in the policy research interface. And we'll have after that, short reporting session so we can all hear what the different rooms have been talking about, and we'll end up with a summary of the workshop. So let me just stop sharing. And I'm going to move to our first speaker. And can I ask Andy, can you share your screen? So our first speaker today will be Dr. Andy Stott, who is a science advisor for DEFRA and the former UK national focal point for the IPBES. So that's the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. What we can see now, Andy, is the bit with your notes. So you may want to display it in the other format.
Is that okay now?
Oh, you have to share it again. We lost your sharing. Brilliant. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Ollie, for the introduction. And I'm also a member of the British Ecological Society Climate Group. And I'm going to give a bit of presentation briefly about my perspective on the policy landscape, how things work and how to get involved. And just start with a little bit of my personal background. I was a science advisor in DEFRA for 30 years, and I retired last year, so I'm now independent. And some of the things that I was involved in, I was the UK science lead on CBD COP negotiations, national focal point for the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. I worked on the Environment Improvement Plan, did the evidence review for that, and developed the outcome indicator framework. And now, since I retired from DEFRA, I managed to sneak back as a member of DEFRA's external biodiversity expert committee. So, I've had quite a lot of experience of this interface between science and policy over the years. And just to sort of, for those of you not familiar with sort of the work within a government department like DEFRA, I've just highlighted the sort of things that, make up the science policy landscape. And a lot of this is led by in-house evidence teams. These are distributed across different policy divisions. So there'll be one on domestic biodiversity policy, one on international biodiversity policy, one working on climate change adaptation, one working on soils and peatland and woodland, etc. So it's a very distributed system of in-house evidence teams. And the sorts of things that they're doing is sometimes they've got a budget, they commission research. They're dealing with the statutory advisors like Natural England, Environment Agency, JNCC, Forestry Commission, etc., who provide advice. They are also working with expert panels who are appointed to offer advice on different issues, working with the NGOs, particularly sort of NGOs who are collecting data, knowledge, and presenting that information to government. They're working through also the research councils and looking at the sort of investment the research councils are making in which is relevant to the work of the department. And then sort of on the international scene, supporting international negotiations through, say, the Convention on Biological Diversity and the UNFCCC, and international assessment, scientific assessment bodies like the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity Ecosystem Services, IPCC, etc. So it's a very wide-ranging landscape of science inputs and activities going on, which are feeding into the work of the department. And in theory, there's a sort of there's a policy cycle which shows how different sorts of evidence and research can feed into different aspects of policy. So if you start here at the top with agenda setting and targets, then the sorts of information that are going to feed into that are assessments and scenarios and models and horizon scanning, which allow you to sort of determine what your objectives of the policy are. And then moving on into policy formulation, you look at different sort of options for implementing the policy, maybe undertake some pilots. Then you get into a decision-making stage, which might involve consultation, doing impact assessments, cost-benefit analysis, bringing a whole range of evidence to bear on the decision being made, getting on into the practical implementation, which is more about providing guidance, best practicing, targeting tools and metrics, and then going on into the monitoring and evaluation side of things. So you can see through that policy cycle, there's a whole range of different types of evidence and science inputs which will support the policy. And I'll just give one very short example, which comes from the climate change negotiation, the Global Biodiversity Framework discussions in Montreal at COP15. And this is looks at one particular target, which is the target or the climate target 8 within the Global Biodiversity Framework, which was originally drafted and to make a specific reference to a target on mitigation. And you'll see I've highlighted there that originally the target referred to ecosystem-based approaches contributing at least 10 gigatons of CO2 equivalents per year to global mitigation efforts. And this was drawn from the scientific literature, and particularly the work by Gerardin, which sort of came up with this figure. And it was the UK who tabled this and got it included in the first draft of the target, because we were very keen to sort of try and get this connection between the climate change mitigation and the Paris Agreement and the CBD and the Biodiversity Convention. We also commissioned some further research which looked at this, and in particular how the different targets within the framework, the targets around protected areas, restoration, could contribute to look at this relationship between the objectives of the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Paris Agreement. I should say that actually what was agreed was somewhat watered down and lost the specific target on mitigation, which was quite a disappointment to the UK. And with more time, I could explain some of the reasons for that, but we ended up with a target which is, doesn't have a specific, it's quite vague. It doesn't have a specific quantitative outcome. But this is just for interest, that the UK has now made its own commitments to meet the Global Biodiversity Framework, which we published just a month or so ago. And I haven't got time to go into those in detail, but I think you'll see in there that there are some very specific commitments there, which the UK has made in order to contribute towards the Global Biodiversity Framework. And those include some which are specific on the relationship between climate change and biodiversity. So just to finish off with, I'll just sort of say briefly about some of the ways how the community, the ecological community supported by British Ecological Society can get involved in this. And I think one of the first things to say is awareness of what's going on is fairly critical. Knowing who's doing what, where and when in the sort of policy context is really important. For example, we've got the CBD COP16 coming up in a couple of weeks' time in Colombia, where some important decisions will be made on climate change and biodiversity. So knowing that that's what the process is very important. And now social media provides a huge vehicle for knowing who's doing what's going on, finding out what's going on, and making sure people understand what it is that you're doing and what you're contributing to the process. Having contacts in relevant NGOs, government agencies, DEFRA and other good government departments, is also important. Knowing who's doing what, who to go to, and who might be interested in the work that you're doing. And you can find out more about this through sort of workshops and conferences. And this is one of those opportunities, I hope. Then there are more formal things like calls for evidence and consultations, which might come from government departments, or some of the international organizations where you can contribute the work from your own research, and feeding into research and research bids and proposals, thinking about that policy cycle and where your research could contribute into that policy cycle. And then there are the sort of other things going on internationally, like international assessments, such as those undertaken by IPCC and IPBES, which are always on the lookout for authors, fellows, and reviewers. And that's a really good way to contribute your work into these international processes. So, yeah, sorry, that's a bit of a rush through, but briefly, that's what I wanted to sort of say by sort of explaining some of the landscape, and look forward to the further discussions. Thank you.
Many thanks, Andy. So our next speaker will be Kirsty Lewis, who is the Climate Security Team Leader at the MetOffice. I don't know if... there you go.
Hi. Sorry, I've been coming in and out, having some Zoom challenges from my government computer. So yeah, thanks very much for asking me to speak today. So yes, my name is Kirsty Lewis. I work at the MetOffice. I'm a climate science fellow there. Actually, I have just come back from, I was a year seconded into the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, where I was the climate science lead in their research and evidence division. So I can talk a little bit, obviously not from a kind of ecological perspective, but from as a scientist providing information on climate science, and specifically, I think, from working in the sort of similar policy environment that Andy just talked about within government. I don't have any nice slides, I'm afraid, but I can just talk generally, I think, from my experience, and a lot of it does overlap with what we've just heard now. So as I said, I was in FCDO, I was sitting in the Research and Evidence Division, and most departments within government will have something similar, some kind of evidence or research area where they develop and respond to the evidence requirements of their department. And each department will have a different role, if you like, in terms of their responsibilities and their policy objectives, which together kind of combine to think about UK interests. So within the Foreign Office, for example, they are responsible for the spending of UK aid. So that's programming around development and also humanitarian assistance. And so a lot of the work that we were doing would be, as Andy was saying, commissioning work or commissioning research, in support of those objectives, or directly supplying evidence for aid programming, development programming, and policy as well. FCDO also is responsible for our diplomatic relationships globally. So there's a whole diplomacy area as well. And so in that sense, there's also evidence needs around that. So how do we decide that we engage with other countries? Where do we decide our priorities and so on? You can think of other departments. So I also do a lot of advice into Ministry of Defence, which is about, UK's ability to respond with force or project UK force overseas. Or DESNES is another department where they have a large kind of research department which looks at things like UK long-term energy supply and transition to net zero. So I think if you're looking at engaging with policymakers, it's worth thinking about which department they're in, what are their objectives, what their particular role in government that they're meeting. And as Andy was saying, there's kind of work that might be going on within those departments about commissioning new research, but there is also work in terms of the direct provision of research to meet departmental evidence needs. And actually for FCDO, there's another component which is around capacity building. So quite a lot of the research that we were commissioning was about meeting our objectives for development. So supporting countries to build their own capacity to understand their climate risks so that they could respond and adapt to climate change themselves. So as I said, the policymakers will sit across departments in government, and each one of them will be led by a chief scientist, and their role is to sort of sit outside of that policy as a trusted advisor and provide evidence that drives the policy. And that's, I think, as per the policy cycle that Andy really nicely set out there. I have to say, in my experience sitting in FCDO and also sitting back here in the Met Office, which is, I don't know if you know, but this is a kind of arm's length body within government, so we're a trading fund, is that the reality is that that's a kind of idealized policy circle. But even when you're sitting directly in government, in a directorate whose role is to provide the research and evidence to policymakers, so you're not even outside in a university trying to feed in, you're sitting inside the evidence provision. It is really hard to influence policy. And although we have this kind of policy cycle and this ambition to have evidence-driven policy, quite often we can get policy-driven evidence if we're not careful. And I think the way that we influence policy, I would say, would be through two key ways. So the first is around the kind of priorities that a department might set for their policies. I think it's always worth remembering when dealing with government that the role of the civil service, and I think this is something that I found quite illuminating when I was in the department, that the role of the civil service is to enact the ministerial objectives. So the policymakers are setting policies to enact what government has set out as its priorities. And it's exactly, as Andy was saying, it's really worth being aware of what's going on. What are those policy objectives? What is the discourse that's happening? So, for example, just a couple of weeks ago, David Lammy gave a speech in Kew about climate and environment and nature. And that's a really good idea of understanding, like, where is the government's focus and priorities in this area that, they're likely to have an interest to, that they'll be receptive to hearing about. But there's also, I think, a role for scientists and science to communicate the truth of that science, so to challenge what those policy priorities are. And that can be very difficult. And certainly I would say sitting within government, it's really hard. Is that realistically, it's not enough having the facts. So I mean, even this morning, I've been involved in a whole discussion about the Met Office being very frustrated that we have this piece of science and the government doesn't seem to be responding, and yet it's really important. And actually, sometimes the best way to influence policy is not targeting policymakers. It's about putting the science in the public domain, communicating to the electorate effectively about, you know, what these real issues are. And those can sometimes a more effective way to sort of steer, if you like. So thought leadership on the kind of public conversation influence the political dialogue, and then that filters down to policymakers as a kind of indirect way of contributing to policy discourse, really. And that can be something that's easier to do from a university, for example. As a government, we're always a government body, we're always policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. And that can sometimes can be really difficult in a kind of in the sort of areas where we work, where, you know, I look at the hard facts of climate change and feel very strongly that we need to communicate the urgency and the scale of ambition that we need on tackling this. And yet I have to, you know, give very measured, if you do this, this will happen, if you do that, that will happen, and then leave policymakers or to make decisions, whilst understanding that they can be in a very constrained political environment to make those decisions. And then just to go the second area, I think, where perhaps we have more traction on informing policymakers is just evidencing action. So assuming there's a policy around a level of ambition or an aim to achieve some objectives, how do you kind of make specific decisions about which choices to make? So, you know we want to tackle climate change. You know, what's the level of temperature ambition we might want, and what's the evidence that we can provide to understand, you know, those decisions. And then it's really critical that we understand something about the decision space, about what agency those policymakers have to enact some change. So we're not just saying, oh, you need to completely stop climate change, or, you know, what levels of power, what agency is there, what are the choices that we're trying to make. So we need to provide evidence that speaks to some of those challenges, some of those trade-offs, and maybe just accept that the policy will be informed by a whole range of evidence. And some of that will be the facts that we present, and some of it will be about the optics, about how decisions will look, or other considerations about being pragmatic relationships with other countries. So I might leave it there. So I wasn't following the chat, so I didn't see any questions, but really happy to take any if there are any.
Great, thanks, Kirsty. Really interesting to hear about actually the constraints of being involved in government institutions and the ability to even enact changes. So if people have any questions, please put them in the chat, and you can also ask questions during the panel discussion. So next we have Mike Morecroft, who's the Deputy Director, Head of Climate Change Science at Natural England, and also former chair of the British Ecological Society Climate Change Group.
Yes, thanks, Orly. Yep, nice to be at a SIG meeting again. And let me just share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can see that. So yes, I'm moving on to think a little bit more about audience and how to make your research relevant to them. I think we'll cover some similar ground, though, to what we've already been talking about, but you know, coming at it from my angle, which may or may not be enlightening, but it's another one. By way of background on me, then, yes, my current role is Deputy Director for Climate Change Science at Natural England. I've been in Natural England for about 15 years now. Before that, I was at the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, UKCEH, for a long time, and PhD and postdoc before that. So I describe myself as someone who very much is a scientist, does research, but also spends a lot of time working with policymakers and practitioners and giving advice. And as you come on, as we go on, I'll expand a little bit when I say policymakers and practitioners, because they both matter and they're a bit different. So some of the other things I do, I'm leading a big program on nature-based solutions for climate change at the landscape scale at the moment, called Nature Returns. I'm also quite involved with the Land Use for Net Zero program. And I've been an IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, lead author, and also been involved in things like the UK Climate Change Risk Assessment. So I suppose the first question really, and I'm going to talk quite a lot about audiences. But before we do that, it's worth saying, how do you make sure your research is relevant in the first place? And because, if you're speaking as a researcher, if your research isn't relevant to policymakers, they're not going to listen to you, frankly. So how do you go about that? Well, it's kind of obvious in some ways, but it's easier said than done. So first of all, listen to the sort of questions people are asking. There's an awful lot of information does come out of government. You can read policy documents and consultations. You can talk to people who are working in policy and practice. If you go to a BES annual meeting, it isn't just scientists, keep your eyes open. There will be people there who do work, particularly on the boundary between science and policy, as I do. A quick plug for the BES policy team. They're going to have their own bit in a minute, but really excellent outputs there that can help you. So to do your homework and look out for opportunities. And I think Andy's said a bit about this, but there's quite a lot out there. There are placements, secondments. You can do joint projects. Case studentship's a good example, on the PhD side. Whether you're the student or the academic supervisor, work with someone from outside academia. Then there are contracts and jointly funded calls for research, like the Land Use Net Zero programme. And it's just worth saying as well, if you are in the business of applying for a contract to do some research for a government department or an agency like Natural England, be aware this isn't quite the same as a Research Council grant. They aren't doing this to further your career or the greater good of science. Read what it says. There are outcomes there for really tangible benefits that they're going to be looking for it. So, if you however great your science, if you don't answer the questions that are being asked, it's not going to go anywhere. And I would also say be ready to respond quickly. Policy tends to move quicker than research does. My colleagues that I work with in DEFRA typically do have to respond within hours or a day or two. I get a little bit longer, but it's if you're not there, if you're not ready, you can miss the boat. I want to think a little bit about some of the audiences there, because they do differ, and we perhaps had a little bit of a sense of that. So politicians, they're the sort of public face of government, but actually you probably won't get a lot of time with them. Not unless you're the big celebrity scientist anyway, which most of us aren't. So, actually, if you want to be involved with government, it's often the civil servants, the people in the government departments. And really be aware there are differences between those who work as policy makers. You typically move around from department to department. They probably haven't got a science, well, they may or may not have a science background. But then there are also, in a department like DEFRA, there'll be evidence specialists who may well have a PhD and will be certainly up to speed with the science as much as you are. And it needs a different approach with those sort of people. Don't forget local government. Don't typically get involved in the big sort of science questions, but there's some really important local level issues around the natural environment, and loads of opportunity for ecologists to work at a local level and really make a difference for the good. I suppose at the other extreme, there's things like the international bodies, like the IPCC. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment, I think. And then public bodies, Natural England, Forestry Commission, Environment Agency. We're not quite the same as a government department. We have a little bit more distance from government. We operate slightly more independently. You still won't find us coming out and making political pronouncements, but we have a degree more independence and often a greater scientific capacity. And then, of course, you can make a difference through dealing with NGOs, land managers, businesses, investors, and a group that sometimes gets forgotten is the environmental consultants. Terribly important people in actually making a difference to what happens on the ground. and then, of course, the public, which Kirsty's just been saying about, who clearly matter. So I'm just going to illustrate this with a few photos. This is Spot the politician, lady in the middle with the orange top on, Rebecca Powell. At the time I took this photo in May, she was the Minister for Nature. And I have to say, this is an opportunity that I've had virtually never in 30 odd years of working in research. I think probably 3 times I've spent a decent chunk of time with the Minister, but Rebecca Powell was out with us for a whole afternoon. The lady to her left, your right, as you look at it, is Marion Spain, Chief Executive of Natural England. I've rarely had opportunity to spend a whole few hours with Marion. And then on the left, you've got my colleagues, Jodie and Becky, explaining their work to Rebecca. I put this in there because I'm to show it does happen, but don't expect it. It's not the norm, however well engaged you are. But and of course, the irony is that about 2 weeks after this, the election was called. She's used to be a minister and actually lost her seat at the next election. So it was a really good afternoon. We were delighted with the impression we made, largely irrelevant, probably in terms of policy influence, sadly. But the person I haven't mentioned in the background, so this is Lucy, and she's a policy advisor in DEFRA. And she's not the centre of attention. She's still in her job. And actually, though the most influential things I've done have often been talking to those civil servants who are much, much more accessible than ministers. You know, you will not get much time with a minister, but you can get time with civil servants, and it's really worth investing in that time if you get the opportunity or make the opportunity. Another thing, this is probably a bit more what you sort of imagine. There's me sort of somewhere in the middle in an environmental audit committee meeting giving evidence. This is a statutory body of Parliament. The select committee system scrutinises things in some detail. An interesting experience if you get the opportunity. It's obviously a very formal sort of occasion. Most interactions with policymakers are not like that. This is quite formal, but it's interesting because it's not the sort of pantomime that you see on the telly. Actually, members of Parliament from different parties getting on perfectly well, often very well informed, asking sensible questions and listening. It's an interesting experience, and be aware, I suppose, that there's a difference between Parliament and government, and that's another part of the complexity here. Another snap. These are the highlights of the last few years, I've got to be honest, but this is a COP27 in Egypt with an IPCC panel. So that's an opportunity there, theoretically, to speak into the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change process. That's what the COPs are all about. Actually, the climate negotiators are all busy negotiating, and it's a bit of a sideshow. But it is an opportunity to share, in this case, our report with a wider public and be part of that international dialogue. And do take those chances if you do get them. But don't despise this sort of thing. This is much more the bread and butter. So this is out with a group of colleagues, with farmers, people we're working with on the ground in Northumbria, demonstrating some equipment, talking about issues. The human conversation is so important, and actually getting outside is one of the great things about working in ecology. And you can often have some really good conversations there. It may not change national policy, but it can make a difference on the ground. And developing that sort of understanding of ecology more broadly really matters. Written outputs. So I still publish papers. Realistically, quite often I'm that sort of person who tags their name on at the end or in the middle, but I can assure you I always do something valuable on it. But they really matter. Don't expect most civil servants, let alone government ministers, to read your actual paper. But if they get picked up in something like an IPCC report, or in this case on the right, the climate change risk assessment technical report, then they contribute to that wider process. There are thousands, tens of thousands of papers published on topics around climate change, every year more or less. So it does need to often go through that sort of synthesis process. There's usually a call for evidence for those. Don't be afraid to submit your papers. And, put your name forward, put your name in the hat, see if you can get involved with one of these things. In Natural England, we also spend a lot of time developing resources that can be used a bit more broadly, like these two around climate change. And for a lot of audiences, those are very well regarded. A report that synthesizes things, doesn't dumb it down, but makes it accessible is very welcome. And both of these reports, one on adaptation, one mitigation, have been downloaded tens of thousands of times and used by practitioners, consultants, policymakers. In terms of other media, webinars are good. Like now, not only the people who are here now, but the people who will look at it later. It's a good way of communicating to people. Social media, maybe. I think it's worth getting out there. It's often for building your credibility within the community rather than reaching beyond it, in my experience. But things like LinkedIn have become quite popular. X has sort of, Twitter has fallen off the radar a bit for a lot of us since Mr. Musk took over. But yeah, there's value in it. I wouldn't waste all your time on it, though. It's no substitute for the depth. And something like a blog can be quite accessible too. So this is my final slide. Just some thoughts about how to communicate to policymakers and practitioners. First of all, know who you're talking to. Different people are different, from the kind of person with a PhD in DEFRA to the farmer on the ground to the generalist policymaker or the local council official. You need to write or talk about things they're interested in, but also tailor it to the audience. And I would say don't make assumptions. If you're not sure what people know or where they're starting from, well, ask, make it a conversation. There's nothing worse than patronizing your audience or leaving them, miles behind. Remember that practice matters as well as policy. You can have a perfect policy, but if it doesn't have a good implementation mechanism, it doesn't mean anything. And we've seen a few of those over the years in all sorts of sectors. So, things like communicating with land managers, with councils, with farmers matters too, and tailoring things to local circumstances. Different channels have value. Sometimes written outputs matter, sometimes spoken is good. And I'd suggest you, play to your strengths, speak about things you're an expert in, and also what you find you enjoy doing. Some of us like talking in front of an audience, some would prefer not to. But I would say give it a try. You won't know unless you do try, and sometimes you can surprise yourself. Certainly when I started out, having just done a PhD, I didn't think I'd be doing half the things I've done. And I have to say, I've really enjoyed it. So with that, I'll stop.
Great, thank you, Mike. So our last speaker is going to be Jeff Price from the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research and the University of East Anglia.
Well, there are no notes, so we'll just stay here. Can you hear me okay? Sometimes the microphone plays up.
We hear you fine, but the display that we're showing is what you want to see rather than what you want to show us. So it's the bit with, we can see the next slide on it. So you can change it in display setting at the top.
Well, I'm not sure what that is. I don't want to waste time.
That's fine. We can see it fine.
Yeah, I'm already on two screens anyway, so it makes it hard. So anyway, I'm taking a slightly different approach, and that is looking at it as if you're a researcher, how do you make sure your research is then relevant to policymakers? And giving some examples from my own research and also from Ellie's research, who's my PhD student. So you start out by changing the way you frame your question. So you would start out by thinking about, well, how do you frame your question as applied ecology and not as basic science? So it's moving away from just doing an impact study, for example, on climate change, and figuring out, well, what are the implications of your impact study? Are you interested in how it may apply to mitigation or to adaptation or to conservation planning? And then think about, well, does the question you're asking, is the research you want to do, does it have any policy relevance? And then finally, you might want to slightly reframe your question to make it more policy relevant overall. So for my own research, I'm talking about the Wallace Initiative. This is work we've been doing for a decade. We've modeled now 135,000 species with SDMs to climate change. And it started by identifying a problem. So as one of the lead authors on IPCC fourth assessment report, what we found is of all of the reports out there on climate change impacts and biodiversity, they were inconsistent. Often they were lacking in critical detail on things like baselines, what scenarios we're using. When they gave a temperature, was it a global temperature? Was it a local temperature? Which made it actually very difficult then to try to reframe the results from those papers in anything that was policy relevant. Many of the papers were just basic science at that time, so they were only talking about impacts. And so what we actually had to do at that stage was reconstruct the papers. We had to go back to the authors. We had to ask critical questions that were missing from the methodology. We had to use climate models to figure out which global temperature they were reaching, if it was a local temperature. How did the baselines match up? And yes, in the long run, we got another paper out of that, but it took months and months of work to actually turn it into a table that was meaningful for IPCC. And so the solution to that, from my point of view, was to put together a team of ecologists, experts in species distribution modeling, statisticians, and experts in high-performance computing. And with only a very tiny amount of seed money, we consistently started developing models for as many species as possible where we could find occurrence data, and doing it in a consistent fashion. So a consistent set of climate models, a consistent set of scenarios, because that's how you get to policy relevant science. And the initial publication that came out of that wasn't in terms of impacts, but it was in terms of what does that mean in terms of mitigation? How much mitigation is needed to avoid impacts? And almost all of the papers that my colleagues and I put out are about avoided impacts, avoided damages. And it's aimed at helping governments set targets. But we also developed a web portal to give users access to the underlying data for conservation use. Now, this initial effort was limited. It was only about 70,000 species. It was at a fairly coarse resolution. It only used 7 climate change models. And so several years later, we started on the next phase of the project. And we wanted to produce results that have broader applicability. And so we were specifically aiming for how do we present results that are relevant to policy, that are relevant to conservation, and are relevant to adaptation. We developed a new web portal, and it was giving with instructions on how you might look at 2 species at one time to see how they might change in interactions. Unfortunately, like many other things, we lost that to COVID when funding disappeared in Australia. So we're still trying to maybe regenerate it at some point in time. But these new results so far have been used in 3 PhDs with 2 more underway. and in multiple EU and UK funded projects. And the goal for all of this has been policy relevance. So we're going beyond peer review. There have been a lot more peer-reviewed papers out of it, but all of them have had additional policy or conservation relevance. What does it mean in terms of conserving natural land? What does it mean in terms of ecosystem services and natural capital? And beyond the papers, there have been many, many reports prepared for both NGOs, but also the UK government. And all of those are either around policy and or adaptation. So using this sort of information then in policy or conservation, the data from the key main paper in 2018 actually was used in 6 different chapters of IPCC AR6, including figures and tables. It was in the press release for Working Group 2. And so all of a sudden, then that's raised to a whole new level where it can influence policymakers. So this directly contributes to informing government. Nationally, the data was used in the OpenClim project in the UK. The OpenClim project is designed to help to inform the Climate Change Risk Assessment 4, which is underway. The data has been used in a project with the EA and FINS 2100. So for looking at climate change in the FINS and what sorts of areas should be set aside. And we have produced 100,000 individual reports for every terrestrial protected area on Earth greater than 1 square kilometer. And these are all going to be on a website, so anybody who works in a national park has access to information on the observed climate change, the projected climate change, the projected biodiversity changes in their park. And so we move from national to local. 25 of these reports have been translated into Spanish by an NGO for the Peruvian Parks Authority, so they can use them to guide their adaptation efforts. Parks Canada requested access to all the reports for the Canadian National Parks to use in their adaptation planning. And several NGOs are using them to guide their conservation, adaptation, and policy activities at the national scale. So with Ellie's project, I started out wanting to work on giraffe. It actually took 2 different tries to get Ellie. The first time we had a student who actually dropped out before they started. And it was aimed because I was interested in giraffe, and I was already working with the Giraffe Conservation Foundation, and they wanted the information as well. And so she could have gone the basic science route, although she probably wouldn't have gotten a PhD, and just modeled SDMs of giraffe occurrence and climate change. But she made it policy relevant. She framed her research in a way that assisted giraffe conservation. So she worked with an NGO from the start, the Giraffe Conservation Foundation. What did they need? She looked at the other stressors around what is affecting giraffe: climate change in lions, climate change in food, land use. She looked at the areas then for no regrets conservation to help guide where should priority conservation activity or relocation take place in the future. And not as part of her original plan, she decided to make an app. And that app is now used to actually show policymakers in their offices or in the field, look, this is what could happen to giraffe. This is why we need to save this place. So this is of direct conservation and policy relevance. So it's much easier to be policy relevant if you consider it from the beginning. How can your question be framed to be more policy relevant? You may never know how policy relevant it is. A colleague of mine and frequent co-author on papers, there's actually a new web portal that will search for your papers and find out how many times they've been mentioned in policy documents. She's found the work has been mentioned in over 600 documents. And this is far more than turns up in Google Scholar or turns up in altmetric scores. So often the science may be used in policy and you're not aware of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and thank you to all our speakers. I wanted to move now to our panel discussions. So if all our speakers can turn their cameras on, please. And the panel discussion will be led by Beth Chamberlain from the RSPB, who's also part of the British Ecological Society Climate Change Group.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Orly, and thanks to all the panelists for such interesting and fantastic talks there. So to kick off this panel discussion, it would be great to hear from, come to Mike first, on, do you think that climate change and the nature link with it is high enough on the political agenda? And, you know, second to that really is, how can we address this if not?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm an ecologist who works on climate change, so of course I don't think it's high enough. Yeah, there's no great surprise there. I think it's worth unpacking the issue a bit, though. I mean, my reading of the new government, and it is still a very new government, is that they are very serious about climate change, but the overwhelming focus is on the energy transition, to phase out fossil fuels and move to renewable energy, and that's understandable. I mean, I don't think one needs to get too ideological about this. When you just look at the breakdown of emissions across the sectors in the UK, it is the big one that has to be sorted to get to net zero. So it's not a surprise that they would target that. And frankly, that's what governments have done of both colours for for the last few decades. The issue is, though, of course, that the energy sector is decarbonising quickly. Transport is following on, but the land and agriculture sectors are not. The emissions are still very high, and I mean, one thing about working with Natural England, you're not really supposed to make political comments, but I don't think it's terribly political to say, actually, I don't think we have a real sense of how strong the government feels about that relative to all the other priorities. But it's clearly on the agenda, and there is also a statutory process that goes beyond the particular government in place at the time. So, it's on the agenda. I think one thing that there is an opportunity coming up, which is the land use framework, which is expected to see the light of day fairly soon. Now, this has been said before, but the government has said that will come out. Have a look at that, because that really does put into focus that our land has to do many things. We've got a limited area, and that brings into focus the importance of the link between nature and carbon, and nature and resilience. That's my main way forward on that. The other thing I would say, though, is we get the politicians we deserve, and actually we need more education and understanding about ecology within the wider population. We can't expect our politicians to have a higher level of understanding than the general populace. So this is on us to actually share that understanding, so people appreciate those links and how important they are.
Great, thank you. That's a really fascinating response and a good tip on the land use framework. Just to very quickly come in on that, just to see if there's anything, actions that people could take away from this. Do you expect that that's the sort of thing there'd be a consultation or, routes that researchers could take to get involved in the land use framework development, or is it already in train?
Watch this space, I think.
Watch this space. Okay.
I can't speak for them on it. I know there's a lot of work going on, and I would guess there would be, if you say, like I said in my talk, keep an eye on what comes out on policy. I'm sure there'll be something coming out on it, in the not too distant future.
Great, thank you.
It's not in my gift to just commit to that.
Kirsty, you've got your hand up.
Well, it was just, I agree with everything Mike said. I have to say, I think from my perspective, I have noticed, say it's a new government, it is a new government, and it's quite early days, but I think I have noticed a bit of a shift in the dialogue moving towards nature and ecology and linking that more closely with climate change. I don't know how much that's going to convey or translate into kind of different kinds of approach or policies, but I kind of am getting the sense of definitely a shift, as you say, the priorities have been around mitigation and low carbon, but in the area I work was the application of our climate science to understand adaptation challenges, definitely an increase in interest and a recognition increasingly that it's not just about limiting the amounts of climate change, the reality of what we're actually facing, the kind of both the kind of biodiversity and climate crises seem to be more palatable is not the word, but like it's easier to talk about those things now. And I think I'm certainly seeing an increase in interest in that. And maybe we'll see that in the kind of funding we get for good research over the next year or two. So I feel that there's a kind of an opportunity here. There's a bit of a moment with a bit of a shift towards practical responses to what we do beyond just cutting carbon.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. And Andy, it would be great to get your take on this as well, and where you think the climate nature link is sitting on the political agenda.
Yes, thanks, Bethany, and thanks, Mike and Kirsty, for that introduction. I mean, I would also agree. I mean, I think that climate nature links are sort of, in one sense, they're high on the agenda. I think they're well understood at both at political levels and in government, nationally and internationally, and there's obviously an awful lot of scientific evidence which underpins all of that coming through IPCC and IPBES and the work that's being done nationally as well, I suppose. And looking back to previous governments, the government of Boris Johnson, Zach Goldsmith were very much onto this agenda. It was claimed to be a top priority for them, and at least sort of internationally, it was sort of presented like that. I mean, I think the only problem I would say with that is that it was one of many enthusiasms, if you like, which weren't necessarily carried through into a coherent policy, and so it was. It was perhaps ineffective in the end, and that, I think that was sort of one of the issues with COP26, where there was a great opportunity there, but we weren't able to seize it. And I think, I mean, but saying it's high on the political agenda, but also then, is it actually turning into action? And I think that's the issue. I mean, I think there are some really good interventions going on, and Mike's referred to some of those already, where you can see that really integrated approach between climate and biodiversity to having good effects. But I think that's not universal, really, and I think there are issues here which are sort of about the sort of sectoral and siloed approach to policy implementation, so that the energy, the agriculture, the conservation, the planning and development sectors, whether you're talking about domestically or internationally, often are not that well integrated together. And that's the land use framework, again, which Mike's and Kirsty just referred to, provides that one of those opportunities to try and bring those sectors together. But I think that's also a message for the research community, is to try to bridge that gap and to speak across those communities, and not also become embedded within a particular sector, because I think often you find that the language and the approaches just don't transfer or engage between different sectors. And I think that's where the science and the research community can make a real difference. They can show the way and provide the tools to make those connections. And I've just also on the international side, I think it's there's a lot there's also a lot being said about, again, trying to bring together the climate convention and the biodiversity convention and get some more coherence between them. And that's would be really desirable. But I think there's also just to reflect on some of the discussions that took place at COP15. It's not that people don't see those connections between climate and nature. I think they do. I think the issue is it comes down to funding, because there's a funding stream going from donor countries to developing countries, which is for climate, and there's also then the argument that you need such a funding stream for biodiversity, and that's will be the big issue to be discussed at the biodiversity convention at COP16. It's mobilizing those funds, and from a developing country perspective, you'd really like to get money for climate change, and then you'd like to get money for biodiversity. And, you know, mixing those two agendas doesn't help them particularly. Whereas, you know, from a donor country perspective, we say, you know, you can see the wins. We can say, oh yeah, we've got, you know, we can use this money that we've got, and it will deliver both for climate change and biodiversity. And that's the way we want to, you know, we like to spend our money. And that's where there's a, you know, a big tension comes in the international debate, because until you can get the level of funding up to the, you know, the sorts of level that are needed, there's always going to be that pressure from, you know, to provide adequate funding for climate change and adequate funding for biodiversity, and not to and trying to sort of find the synergies between them is not really in the interests of some countries. So I think that sort of underpins some of the reasons why it's difficult to make progress in that area. But as I said earlier, I think one of the ways forward is for the science community to make sure they're speaking across the sectors and joining up across the sectors and providing the tools that work across the sectors to make it easier to be picked up in policy.
Great, thank you. And yeah, really, really useful to have quite a tangible action that people can take away and think about when formulating their research. Jeff, do you want to come on this?
Well, unfortunately, I have a slightly more negative view than Andy does. You know, what I see is that often the policies and the work done by biodiversity in most countries is in one government agency, and the work on climate change is in another government agency. And often the government agency working on climate change is a much stronger government agency. And so you see much more progress done on climate change than on biodiversity. But it really trickles through to the treaties as well. So I've been part and watching over the last 20 years between CBD and the UNFCCC, and there have been minor efforts on the part of CBD to address climate change. Obviously, the UNFCCC has had biodiversity as part of IPCC, at least as the third assessment report, but there isn't the real strong links that there needs to be between CBD, desertification, migratory species, and the climate change treaties. And so you're not getting the synergies that you could otherwise get. And these silos continue even when you get to IPBES and IPCC. There have been limited interactions between the two. There was a meeting held recently, and the decision, I think it was actually on the IPCC side, it may have been on the IPBES side, is, well, we know we need to work together more, but we can't see any time in the immediate future when it will happen. And yet these are the organizations that can make it happen. So you're ending up with entrenching the silos, which makes it much more difficult to deal with what is essentially the same problem. You know, we have better land use, we need better land use to address mitigation problems, and yet different agencies are working on it.
Great, thank you. That's really interesting and interesting to hear a range of perspectives as well. On the one hand, there is some cause for optimism, and the other that actually we really need to break down the silos that people are working in, and the role that science can play in doing that and making that really accessible, I think, is positive to take away from this. Jeff, actually, I'd like to stay with you for the next question. So thinking more from the research perspective, how do you choose a research project if you want to have impacts directly?
Well, it helps if you've worked for a lot of groups. So in my case, I've worked for NGOs, I've worked for IGOs, I've worked for consulting, I've worked for government, although it's US government. I've worked in academia. And so from that, you pick up what's the language that people talk about? How do they need to understand the information? So I think if you don't have the luxury, or if you haven't been a nomad and floated from job to job, then how do you do it if you're coming from a straight academic perspective? And I think, again, the question is, you may be doing brilliant research, but it may not be applied enough. And it's important then to see where the gaps are. Another paper on the impacts of climate change on species Y isn't going to make much of an impact in IPCC. At the start of AR6, I did a quick search on, I think it was extinction, and there had been something like 4,000 papers published in the previous year. And they're all saying the same thing. So is there something that we don't know? Well, we know almost nothing on below ground processes in climate change. We know almost nothing about fungal and mycorrhizal networks in climate change. So these are key components. And if it happens to be your field, then it would be an important component to work into. If you have your favorite taxa, and so I really want to work on giraffe, then it's not a question of just, well, how will climate change affect giraffe? Because there are all of the other things that are already affecting giraffe. And then there's all of the interactions of giraffe. And so being able to study a species in detail takes a different set of science. And it means starting out actually working with a conservation group that works with that species. What do they need? Now, within IPCC, at the end of many of the chapters, there are research needs. And so you can almost start there and say, well, what are the research needs going forward? What is the research needs in biodiversity? Where are the gaps? Where are the research gaps? And Mike talked about some of this, and Andy talked about some of this in terms of where, trying to study what policymakers are looking for. A lot of that's UK focused. So it's important to look elsewhere. And you need to not make assumptions. So with these reports that we generated, I simply assumed that the U.S. National Park Service, which has very good climate scientists from the top down, but the reality I was hearing from the people on the ground was, but we don't have that information at the park level. And this is a reiteration from, I was attending a sub-stuff for the UNFCCC, and what I was hearing from developing countries are, we can't access the climate data, or we don't have access to the biodiversity data. So as you're setting up your research, how do you make it more accessible? And one of the easy ways of doing that is simply making sure that you write your papers for the public. You can write a paper for Nature, which is incomprehensible, or you can write the same paper for Nature that anybody can read. Aim for something that other people can read, and it's more likely to be picked up.
Great, thank you. I think a wealth of advice in there that people can take away. It's really good to hear. So following on from that, assuming we've kind of managed to get that a good starting point with our questions, it would be great to hear more about how to get outputs out to actually influence policy. So Kirsty, I know you talked a bit about this. You talked about, it's not enough having the facts. So how is it that you can better influence policy? And perhaps you could talk a bit on maybe modes of communication, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we've all been sort of saying a similar sort of thing on this in terms of how you get to influence policy is really understanding that policy perspective. So really familiarizing yourself with what the priorities, the objectives are in that policy context. And I think particularly, I think I'd also emphasize what those decision options are. What is it that the policymaker is trying to do and is faced with, and where are the evidence gaps that mean that they don't know which is the right policy to choose? So I think becoming really integrated and understanding that policy complex, and then look back on your own research and your own outputs to understand that interpretation. I think as scientists, we kind of like to make sure we're very thorough and rigorous, but there's also an opportunity to, or a need, I think, to also be able to say, how do we make this digestible? And Jeff just talked about it directly, make things that you write readable. I mean, that might seem really obvious, but just being technically correct and robust is never enough. If it's not communicating the essence of what you're talking about, the outputs aren't going to have any influence. And you have to think about the different levels of the people who will be reading this. So there needs to be that kind of scientific rigor, that underneath what you're talking about, but then also needs to be the kind of that's so what, if you like, that what does this actually mean, that you take some time to do some interpretation. I mean, so I just wrote a paper about 5,000 words, and then I got asked by FCDO, we're really interested in this, can you do us a 2-pager? I wrote a 2-pager, and then they came back and said, can I have 1 paragraph on this? And I think it may go further, and that's a really good sign, because it means people are reading and it's going forward. But I'm just waiting tomorrow to be asked for what's the one headline that you want, what's the one thing you can say to a minister quickly about. And you do kind of have to think about those things at a different level. And if you've only got 1 line or 1 paragraph, it is the so what. It's not all the detail of what goes underneath. This is the thing that you need to know for your decision context and your priority. The one thing I would say is we did, a few of us have touched upon the fact that there are some well-informed, scientifically literate kind of advisors within government who are there to support policy. And that was, I guess, was the role I had in FCDO as the climate science lead now, sitting in the research and evidence division as an advisor into the policy directorates. But it's still worth recognizing that these are kind of intelligent users of this information, but they still need some help. And I think there's a really important role for researchers in terms of shaping the market. So we just talked about some of these kind of nexus or cross-siloed issues, helping policy makers to understand that there are issues there and how to frame the right questions that they ask can really help as well. So it's not just making our science speak to the policy, but also helping policymakers to ask the right questions, fund the type sort of research. And that does involve building a bit of a relationship with policymakers or the science advisors within there. But I think there is an important role to provide some leadership, particularly on these cross-cutting issues where that transdisciplinary perspectives are really critical, kind of understanding how to frame the questions. What are the real issues here that they need to be get to the bottom of, that we can respond to with our research? So it's a bit of directing our science to match the policy requirements, but also a bit of work to help kind of shape what that policy is.
Great, thank you. And just to follow on from that then, and thinking about stakeholders, it would be great, Kirsty, actually, as well, if you could expand a little on how do you work with stakeholders and how do you choose who to work with? And perhaps Mike as well, given your experience, we could hear from you on that as well.
So I think this is really interesting, and maybe it does transfer to ecology, but I think for climate science, it's such a politicized sort of field. And I think in the MetOffice, I've said before, we take this kind of policy relevant, not policy prescriptive balance between, and we kind of present things in a very fact-based way. But actually, policy is not just about fact. It's also about the values that we hold, the decisions that we might decide, like how much do we invest in particular forms of action. And so really communicating the meaning of the evidence, sometimes working with stakeholders can be really critical around that. So it's about, I think about the relationships you build. So I see my role as kind of being quite objective science, but I understand that policy comes in a kind of judgment basis. So we always present, okay, this amount of warming, this number of impacts, if you do this, this will happen. And to me, the evidence of that, particularly if it's graphical or, data based, really jumps out. But that isn't always what gets then communicated. And I find it really interesting when policymakers reflect back about what they heard I said, whereas to me, I've said something really, okay, this is really serious messaging we're putting here. And they say, oh, that sounds okay. Or, it's sort of interesting. So I think a stakeholder engagement can be really important for having people that you work with and understanding those points, because there's an opportunity to really explore what this means from different perspectives. So I think someone once said to me, I was saying something about being careful about being alarmist. That's a big criticism of climate scientists. Someone said, well, it's not alarmist if it's alarming. And the evidence of the science we're presenting very often is very alarming. And so engaging with stakeholders to understand that, getting partners who can really talk about the interpretation that about what you're saying means. So who have skills around communication, who can explore that decision context. Things like, and we do a lot of work with think tanks, for example. That can be a really useful way of having people have good policy understanding, understand the right language and the communication, the methods, and can engage on what the substance of what you're saying is as well. So I present stakeholders, kind of collaborators, but who we choose to work with is important there. And also understanding where being careful, I think, about who you're working with to make sure that we kind of have shared values and shared objectives about the premise, the importance of, you know, being fact-based and evidence-based.
Fab, thank you. That was great. And yeah, Mike, have you got anything to add on that? Any further perspectives?
About stakeholders, yeah. I mean, I've got to be honest, I don't like the word stakeholder. It's the sort of thing, sometimes a certain sort of academic asks you to be a stakeholder, which means to me, come along to a workshop at the beginning of my project and then come back at the end and I'll tell you what you need to know. And you know, okay, there is a place for that, but I also think about partnership as well, and actually working with people. You know, I can be either side of this, and sometimes people come to me, you know, researchers come to me wanting to work with me or have my input in some way, but I'm always much, you know, if I just speak as, you know, on the other side of the table for a minute, you know, it's always better to engage sooner rather than later. Please do not send me an email, you know, a week before the closing date for NERC and ask me to write you some sort of impact support thing. I think things have got a bit better with the NERC system, but you know, it takes time to build up those kinds of relationships where you really understand. And you know, for me as a scientist, I mean, one of the things I love about working in Natural England is that I have colleagues who are much more practical than I am, and you know, will make those decisions on the ground about, you know, a national nature reserve. Do I graze this area or do I not graze it? Do I put a fence here or over there? Do I try and buy the land next door? That's quite a difficult one, but it is sometimes possible. You know, and actually hearing about some of their real life challenges makes me a so much more useful researcher, not necessarily a better one, but a more useful one, because I can ground it in that sort of reality. And also I like to think that then when I do go and talk to someone in, you know, in government, actually I can bring a little of that sort of practical know-how. All right, it's secondhand, but at least it's not third, fourth, fifth hand, you know, into the room. I think I'd noticed someone put in the chat about bringing natural and social sciences together. I think also collaboration between disciplines is really interesting. One of the things I really enjoyed about my my recent IPCC experience was towards the end of the process, going beyond my ecologist world and talking with social scientists with a different perspective, and I found that very enriching. And I think, you know, what we came up with between us was stronger than what we might have done as individuals. So, you know, put time into it and build the relationships. I think, you know, yes, there will be times where you just need to take, you know, have a workshop for a few people and it's a hit and run sort of thing, or do a survey. But I would encourage people, if you can build relationships with a wide range of different people involved in your field, but not the same as you, then, you know, I think you'll benefit a lot.
Great, thank you. And it really continues that theme of working across silos, which is interesting to hear is something you could embed into your project. And Andy.
Yeah, well, just to follow up a little bit on that, I mean, I think one thing you can think about is, who are the gatekeepers? Who are the people who are, you know, standing between your research and some decision maker? And I think you could say that, you know, the four of us on this panel have been gatekeepers in different regards, and I think that's, you know, quite critical to be aware of people who are in that position, and you know, can be really helpful, you know, because they're the ones who can you know, decide what information needs to be passed on. They can reach out to sort of, you know, seek information, find out what the research community know, or you know, or in the case of Jeff, it's, you know, it's being in a position to package together the information that's coming from the scientific research in a way that can be digested in the policy system. You know, so there are sort of gatekeepers, sort of perhaps either side of the fence. You know, on the one hand, they're sort of acting as channels to communicate with the policy community, and on the other hand, in the policy community, reaching out to the science community and making those connections. Just on the sort of issue about the sort of socioeconomic side, I mean, I think, you know, that's obviously very critical in any decision-making process. And, you know, when I refer to evidence teams in DEFRA, they're normally multidisciplinary teams, you know, which will include some natural scientists, some economists, some social scientists, maybe statisticians and you know, data scientists, etc. And, you know, I think those sort of environments are really very productive places to work and to try to, you know, working as part of that team to bring you know, the relevant evidence together. You know, at the end of the day, the decisions that are made, you know, the natural science input will be, you know, one element of it. You know, the impacts on society or opinion polls will be another, and the, you know, the economic costs and how they're and benefits and how they're distributed, you know, will be another, and all that is going to feed into the policy making, you know, policy making process, which, you know, often results, you know, can result in what might be considered sort of suboptimal outcomes in a way from a science perspective, but from the political perspective. And you can, you know, I'm sure you've your own views on that, but, you know, it can, you know, be swayed by one particular type of evidence or another. But that's, you know, but that's the sort of system we operate in. And as I say, within, you know, within the government departments, the role of the evidence team is to try to bring together those different arguments and present them in a way that could be used in policy making.
Great, thank you. That was really useful. And I think we've got time for just 30 seconds maybe from each panelist actually on this last question before we take some of the questions from the chat. But just as a really quick summary, and maybe again, hopefully a bit of an optimistic message, but wait to hear that from you. But how much does research really inform policy making? Big question, but if we could have really short answers, that would be great. Andy, I'll start with you.
Well, I'd say hugely, really. But as I just explained, you know, you've got to sort of look at it in the round in terms of the sorts of information that decision makers are trying to digest, and therefore you may not, you know, get the outcomes that you might expect from having the good science. But then, you know, I mean, one of the big issues here is the uncertainty. You know, the science is never really good enough. To give very, you know, and scientists are also very uncomfortable about, you know, making sort of firm statements about, you know, this is going to happen, or, you know, this, you know, if you do this, this is what happened. It's all, you know, risks and uncertainty, gaps in knowledge, whether the knowledge can be applied in a particular circumstance or not, and all those issues, you know, come to bear. So, you know, I think, you know, as we've sort of described, there is a huge apparatus out there to try to get good evidence into policy making, and you know, I think it's working reasonably well. But then, you know, there are pressures on this as well, because there are people who want to disrupt that for different reasons. There's lots of misinformation, and, you know, that can become really quite, you know, challenging as well. So I don't want to be too optimistic, Jeff, on this. But I think, you know, there are the mechanisms there, but it's a constant battle, and I think that battle's getting more difficult, or has got more difficult, just because of the challenges that there are to a good, solid evidence base.
Great, thank you. And have any of the other panelists got something that they'd like to add to that? Otherwise, we'll move on to the questions in the chat. Mike and...
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always that sort of balance between hope and realism. But, you know, when you look at the whole climate change agenda, we wouldn't even be having half these conversations if it wasn't for research that was done, you know, decades ago. And, you know, we turned off the last coal-fired power station yesterday. that wouldn't have happened without research. But it's hard to pin it down to, you know, one paper published then that did that. You know, it's a cumulative thing. And, you know, I'm just picking up a few of the other things in the chat. You know, evidence synthesis in all its various forms really matters. You know, what one study says versus what, you know, the consensus of the scientific community does. The trouble is although policy can react very quickly to events, you know, it's the thing about the minister wants to know this by lunchtime, which does happen. The actual weight of legislative change and the whole changing of public expenditure, and that takes a very long time. It's not happening fast enough, is it? That's the trouble.
Thank you. Jeff.
The reality is, if it's not in the peer-reviewed literature, it's not going to be an IPCC. And many governments, if it's not an IPCC, it doesn't count. And so you really have to do this. I would much rather right now be putting my information out where people could actually use it, apply it on the ground where I could see conservation happening, because that happens faster than policy often does. But the reality is I have to keep publishing the papers in peer-reviewed literature, because then they're picked up in IPBES or they're picked up in IPCC, and then that helps inform policy in part down the road.
Okay, thank you. Really useful to hear. I think the overriding message then is keep plugging away, everyone. Orly, I think you're going to now chair some of the questions from the chat.
So thanks, everyone. So we have, I'll read a couple of questions from the audience because some of them have already been answered. So the first one is from Toyin Oshaniwa. And Toyin is asking, how do we build a nexus between action/evidence-based research and potential policy formulation? Anyone interested in answering that?
I don't know if I can answer that exactly, but I mean, I think we have been describing that to an extent here, haven't we? I mean, I think, you know, partly what we've been trying to do is to explain some of the elements of that nexus between, you know, the research and the decision-making processes in different contexts, and, you know, from our different perspectives, trying to explain, you know, how that works and with this and amongst this community, you know, to try and make it work better. So I'm not sure whether that answers the questions, but I think that's sort of what we've been trying to get at. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. And Jeff, you got your hand up.
I think it's a question of building bridges. It's not enough to write the paper. Sometimes it's a question of interpreting the papers and looking at your paper in the context of other papers, and then working with the groups who need the information to provide the information to them in a way that they can actually use it. And I agree with Mike. I don't like the term stakeholder. I much prefer co-produced information, where you're actually working with the groups to figure out what they need. And it may not be exactly what you want to do, but then you're making sure that your research is actually being able to be applied on the ground.
Thank you, Jeff. So I'm going to move to our next question. That's from Catherine Monk, asking, it would be good to hear about the speaker's use of rigorous and repeatable evidence synthesis in these processes, particularly given the outcomes of the What Works Climate Solution Summits, the Global Evidence Summit, and the current major funding for global evidence infrastructure. I wonder if Mike or Kirsty would like to say something about this.
Yeah, I mean, I've said a little bit, but I think, you know, evidence synthesis really matters, but there are different forms of it as well. I mean, these last 15 years, I have spent quite a lot of time on it myself, and, you know, things like the IPCC and IPBES are very much in that space. But, you know, there's obviously also the sort of systematic review type approach. Different things work for different different contexts. I mean, I do notice sort of, you know, what work centre in government, for example, is a slightly different thing. You know, much more about the sort of monitoring and evaluation of what happens. And, you know, if you say evaluation in a government department context, there's a whole thing around the so-called Magenta book, and there's a whole world, and the Treasury actually is really big on this sort of thing. If you have money from the Treasury, which I have done recently, you know, you've got to really show that you are evaluating what works and what doesn't. You know, often through social science methodologies, actually, of interviews and so on. So, you know, I think it's critical. You know, however good a study is, it is only one study, and there is so much more weight with more. But you know, it's combining those multiple forms of evidence as well that you know, gives it strength. So, no, I think it's a critical part of the picture.
Thank you, Mike. Perhaps last question from the audience, and that's a question that more looks at the global perspective, and that's from Shamsuddin Abdullahi, asking what bits of evidence could you suggest to someone who comes from a country like Nigeria, where the majority of the policymakers don't value much ecological conservation activities over their political ambitions? So what is the possible way to make them understand the necessity of intervention with global ecological trends?
Well, I'll have a go at that, but it'd be fairly crude, I think.
Yeah.
So I think there's, you know, two things I'd say on that. One is, you know, international processes. In Nigeria's, you know, part of international processes, signatory to the Convention on Biological Diversity, for example, and you know, so there are, you know, those international processes are ones which, you know, can reach out to and bring those governments into the processes better. And there's, you know, there's a lot of support within some, you know, within some of the conventions to support, you know, countries to implement the requirements of those conventions. Whether they do or not, you know, is up to the, you know, the political situation, and you know, as the question suggests, that that may not be important in some countries. So I mean, that's one side of it. I think the other side is from the you know, the UK as a donor side of things, and you know, how can, you know, we working with the Nigerian government and within country projects within country sort of try to deliver on the ground anyway, but also to deliver on the sort of infrastructure that goes with that nationally, so that it's can be seen to be important for the government to engage in it if it's, you know, if it's actually delivering, you know, benefits which are, you know, can be economic benefits as well as social benefits, and for the, you know, for the biodiversity or climate. That's my sort of crude attempt.
Thanks, Andy. And Kirsty, you got your hand up as well.
I suppose I had a similar sort of point as that last one there about thinking about that policy perspective and what are the priorities of the government and what is the value of what you're looking at from that perspective. I know we've talked a lot about traditionally in climate, thinking about nature and ecology as a kind of nature-based kind of services and things like how it's managing climate. But I think increasingly bringing this kind of nature and climate nexus together is about the fact that we have a crisis in both, and those have severe implications for the objectives within all governments, really, about their kind of social contract to meet the needs of their population. Is that actually, as a human race, we can't, you know, we can't survive without managing both climate and nature and ecology challenges that we face. So I think it's about looking for where that win is, understanding what those policy objectives are and what is the research that you're doing and the things that you're valuing. How do they align with that? I mean, it's not without controversy. I mean, we know certainly around kind of the security perspective on climate change has questions on whether we should be valuing nature for its own right. But I think trying to find that common ground maybe is where you get that opportunity to think about, opportunities to get support for the kind of research that you might want to do.
Thanks, Kirsty. Thanks everyone for the great panel discussion. It's really good to hear the different perspectives on things, but also the different challenges as well that perhaps are experienced by people around the world trying to engage with policy. So we're going to move now to hear from Rob Booth from the British Ecological Society policy team about different activities that they're involved in. Rob?
Thanks, Orly. Can everyone hear me okay?
Perfect.
Yeah, thank you for a really interesting panel discussion, and thank you to all the panelists, many of whom I know have been involved with the British Ecological Society in various ways for a number of years, so thank you. I work in the policy team at the British Ecological Society, and we attempt to build that interface that we've talked about, or that has been discussed in the preceding conversation, between the research community and the policymaking community in a variety of ways. At the moment, we're predominantly active in the United Kingdom, and we have groups of active BES members in Wales, England and Scotland who work with myself and my colleagues to organise various events and activities aimed at advocating for evidence-based policy in ecological policymaking and cognate fields. That will include public-facing events in each of the nations of the United Kingdom on a relevant, to use a perhaps contentious term, on a relevant topic in each year. We run training events as well in person in each of the United Kingdom's nations. And we also run expert workshops where we look to bring together specific experts, invited experts, with policymakers to sort of hash out a specific conversation on a topic, which in our experience sort of creates the freedom to have that interface in a way that perhaps stakeholder engagement by public bodies wouldn't allow, whilst also putting people directly in touch with policymakers to answer the very pragmatic questions. So in the coming weeks in England, we'll be bringing people together to talk about metrics of species abundance, which is a really, really interesting thing, part of the big kind of drive on environmental targets in England. We also do more kind of organisationally wide, what we call proactive policy work, which often takes the form of bringing together a group of experts to do evidence synthesis or similar on a specific topic. So if you're interested in that, and I know someone, I think Mike did plug our reports, which I really welcome. We've worked in the past in protected areas and nature-based solutions, and at the moment we're bringing a big project that's been going on for a couple of years now on agriculture to a close, where we've tried to provide and curate evidence synthesis that is specifically targeted towards answering policy-related questions. We also offer opportunities for early career researchers to do fellowships in the United Kingdom with public bodies. We'll have 3 fellows going in this year, with the 2 with the OEP, the Office for Environmental Protection, and 1 at Natural England. That fellowship opportunity with Natural England is currently open, so please take a look at our X page or our LinkedIn for more information of that, or our website. And we also offer opportunities for people who may be in a more medium or advanced stage in their career within academia to sort of act as spokespeople on specific issues. When things arise in the news on a specific topic, we'll often look to members with a specific expertise to kind of provide a quote or a comment to the press, because obviously policy has a significant kind of communications and public engagement element, which we've talked about, and that's something we're keen to help ecologists from diverse fields kind of cultivate and work with. Finally, we have our special interest groups, like the Climate Change Special Interest Group, many of whom are explicitly, increasingly taking on a policy dimension, which is really, really fantastic to see. And in the policy team, we're always interested in working with those SIGs to make sure that they can have as much reach as possible. That's sort of a brief overview. I'll drop the policy email address into the chat if anyone's got any further questions, and do just take a look at the website. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks, Robin. And I wonder if you can say just in a few words, how can people get involved? So I know you mentioned about the different fellowships opportunities that you have, but how can people be involved with the wider work of the British Ecological Society policy team?
You can become a member, which I'm of course kind of obliged to advocate. So please look into membership options. For students, the first year is free, and then you'll be more involved in our communications to know what we've been doing. The policy groups themselves are sort of refreshed on a semi-regular basis, but there will be an application process for that. So keep your eyes peeled through social media channels for opportunities to get involved through that route. And then there are kind of more ad hoc pieces of work which kind of emerge depending on the news cycle or the policy cycle, and we'll kind of often express or put things out through our communications channels when those sort of things are happening. For example, I know that there'll be lots of discussion on the land use framework, which has already been mentioned, and I'm sure there'll be stuff through our social media channels about our engagement with that. But yeah, follow us through social media, sign up to our newsletter through the website, and yeah, please do consider becoming a member.
Great, thank you very much, Rob. So let me just share my screen. We're gonna move now to the breakout sessions. We're gonna have 6 breakout rooms, and people will have an opportunity then to engage in more depth with the different speakers that we had today. And we're gonna have 10 minutes for the breakout session. We're gonna focus on 2 questions. The first is, how can researchers bridge the gap between research and policy? And the second one is, how can your research inform policy? And that's an opportunity for actually people to throw some ideas and have a bit more of a think about it. Let me stop sharing, and I'll put the questions here in the chat, and we can move everyone into breakout rooms for 10 minutes, and then we'll come back for a very brief session where we're just going to discuss a few things that came out in the breakout rooms. So I hope you all had good discussions in your breakout rooms. Wanted to have very briefly, if every person leading discussions in the breakout room can very quickly report back to us. Suppose we can start with, I know the room that I was in, so I can say, Rob, I know you led the discussions in our room. So if you can start with giving us a very quick 1-minute overview of the discussions.
Yes, happily. Thanks, Wally. We had an interesting discussion, which kind of mixed both questions at once, which started with kind of considering where people are positioned as a researcher and where the kind of research gets initiated, because we're talking about an example of someone, Anjan's research, which was kind of initiated and started within a public body or as a result of kind of impetus from the public. And I know that's often the case. That's often the case with people in the UK as well. And then we kind of we talked about, okay, if we're within one kind of space where the research has been instigated for kind of policy development purposes, what about different stakeholders who might be involved with policy delivery and the complexities which kind of arise from translating kind of information or outputs from one kind of forum to another, which was quite interesting. And again, as an example of that bridge, but also the different ways that research can inform policy in terms of both kind of development and implementation. We also talked about, I talked about the importance of working with social scientists, because that's my background, but it is something that I would advocate for, because it helps really, I think, with those translations, particularly to non-technical kind of policymakers. And then we talked about kind of communication as well, and various means of kind of communicating and synthesizing and distilling research, which again, using examples from Debanjan's research, in terms of how that can be kind of communicated more simply to diverse audiences. It's a nice discussion. Thanks, Wally.
Brilliant. Thanks, Rob. Next, Jeff, I believe you led a breakout room as well.
It was a very one-on-one conversation with Torin about his research, and showing that there's multiple ways in which an academic can start to inform policy or want to initiate change. The natural goal is that you go for the top. And yet, as an individual scientist, unless you're a Chris Packham or a David Attenborough or somebody, the top isn't really going to listen to you. And so in his particular case, we were talking about how going for what I would call the middle managers, the middle level, the NGOs like the National Farmers Union or Nature Scott or Scottish Wildlife Trust, getting them interested in the work, them embedded in what he's talking about, them concerned about his issue, that they would have more success, perhaps, pushing up to the government than an individual scientist would in the same situation. So it's sort of thinking tactically about how do you get your science moved into policy.
Yeah, really interesting. And I completely agree. A lot of my engagement with policy has been through conservation organizations that I work with, which is an easier route in a way for researchers sometimes. Kirsty, you led a room as well?
Oh, in theory I did. I'm afraid no one in our room was able to like connect or use their microphone. So we had a little break, sorry, in our 10 minutes, and I don't have anything to report back. Apologies.
It's okay, thank you. We always have technical difficulties with these online meetings. Mike, did you manage to lead a room?
Yeah, we had quite a good chat. Yeah, so we were able to span experience in India, Nigeria, and the UK. And I think, yeah, it was interesting. I mean, yeah, we touched on quite a few things. So the importance of intermediaries and bringing people together, in places where the science can, get through to the policymakers, that sort of meeting place, I suppose. And the importance of dialogue as well, actually having a two-way conversation is really important in this. And then building on that dialogue to build the evidence for something that can become an actual plan to do something. And we did hear some examples of that. And the final reflection we had was working in DEFRA, actually, Kate from York these days. But when people say evidence, they often mean economics. And we haven't really touched probably enough as much on that as perhaps we should have done, actually. So, actually economic evidence really is important to governments. It's not just in the UK, it's everywhere. Ultimately you have to balance the books if you're a government, or you have massive problems. So how we make the case alongside economics, and how we make sure, I suppose, and I'm going a little bit freestyle now, that actually we properly cost the benefits of nature as well as its intrinsic value really does matter.
Yeah, really interesting, and actually lead to some discussions we had in our room as well. Rob mentioned about the importance of engaging with social scientists, engaging with economists, and not just with ecologists and natural scientists. Andy, did you have any discussions in your room?
Yes, we did. Yeah, we heard from Becky and Maren Sangler about their research projects, and so one was at the outset and starting out and reaching out to the potential users of it, and the same sort of point that there are these sort of middlemen, if you like, or middle people. The Wildlife Trust, BTO, members of sort of expert committees, for example, who might be more accessible, than the sort of final policy maker, but they a good place to sort of clue into what's needed, what's going on, and to shape the work. And in that context, it was important to have that discussion early on, open-ended, to help formulate the research question, which I thought was was very interesting. And then on the other hand, the other project was coming towards the end and thinking about how to get the impact, and they're thinking about how to tailor the research findings to different audiences and get to understand the audiences and who could help to identify those audiences and the sort of style of writing needed, which is quite different from sort of writing up a PhD or writing a scientific paper. So yeah, those are the two sort of examples that we looked at in our group.
Great, thanks, Andy. And Beth, I believe you led also a room.
Yes, yeah, I had a really interesting discussion with Annie, Simon, and Rosie. So I think the key takeaway was thinking about knowing your audience and the importance of communication, and also some of the routes that we could take to get to policymakers. indirectly. So Simon, for example, suggested that universities might have specialist research centres, which in turn themselves will play a role in translating for policymakers. So it could be worth tapping into that sort of route. Another point that was really emphasised is that idea of working across disciplines and how important that is. So be it behavioural scientists who can come at an issue with a different perspective, or thinking about businesses as well, which hasn't been touched on much, as Mike said earlier, the economic side, but actually businesses as a group to influence, and thinking about big supermarket chains, for example, and their thoughts on sustainability as a route to try and impact. That can be an effective partnership. So that could affect policy change whilst actually not directly being you communicating with the policymaker. So yeah, a variety of people and voices is key, and really the importance of networking within that. So yeah, I hope anyone else can jump in if I've missed something there.
Thanks, Beth, and great to hear all these great discussions that have been taking place. I'm just going to briefly summarize, because I can see that we're already over time, and just to ask people who participated to please send us some feedback about this event. There's a QR code here you can use, as well as sign up to our climate change SIG newsletter if you haven't signed up to us yet. And I wanted to finish by thanking all our panel members for coming and talking about their experience and really sharing really important information about how to engage with policy and how to really make the first steps in making your research matter. But also sharing the perspectives of the challenges that are found along the way. I wanted to also thank all the members of the British Ecological Society Climate Change group that have been contributing to that. So we had Beth chairing the panel, we had Andy, who's actually one of our speakers today, but we also had here Ellie, who's been working behind the scene and organising everything, and Torin and Simon, who've been contributing to the discussion. So thank you, everyone, and thank you, everyone who attended this workshop. I hope you found it useful.